Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today we're going to be doing a video that I've wanted to do for quite some time and many other Doctor Who YouTubers have done, but I've never done before. This is going to be my top 10 worst episodes of Doctor Who, specifically of the modern era, so that's 2005 onwards. If this video does well, I'll consider doing a classic list. For the rules of this list, I've tried to make it so that only one episode per series can be incorporated, so we haven't got like 5 episodes from one series and then one episode from another. I've tried to balance it out a bit. Two-parters are also permitted, but with the rules out the way, let's get into the list. Also, feel free to subscribe if you are new. We're trying to get to 40,000 subscribers as quickly as possible, and we're just over 50 subscribers away from 19,000, so any support would be greatly appreciated on that front. But with that said, let's get on with the list. So this list is in no particular order, just some of the episodes that I personally don't love, and bear in mind, some of these I dislike more than others. And we're going to start off with The Caretaker. The Caretaker is one of those episodes where it does have its moments. I particularly love the scene where the Doctor meets the person that he thinks is Clara's boyfriend and is delighted at the fact that it's someone who resembles his past incarnation. Other than that, though, whilst this episode tries to be funny, a lot of the time I find that its humour generally falls flat. The story feels rather tensionless. I mean, the monster itself feels like a complete monster of the week, you know, a very, very forgettable threat. And bear in mind as well, you know, I've been on a bit of a journey with Series 8. It's kind of grown on me a lot. The likes of Into the Dalek and even Deep Breath have grown on me, and obviously you've already got your bangers like Flatline and Mummy on the Orient Express. And this, by contrast, just feels a bit naff, is the best way I could describe it. I've never been the biggest fan of the Danny Pink Clara storyline, if I'm honest. And a lot of this episode hinges on that, which might also contribute to me not really loving it that much. I also think this episode introduces us to Courtney Woods, or at least she plays a part in this story, which again, never been a big fan of that character. So yeah, overall, The Caretaker, it's just never been a great one for me. I remember rewatching it a little while ago and I found it a real struggle to get through. So yeah, The Caretaker is unfortunately the first entry on the list. Next up then, I think I'm going to go for Fear Her. Fear Her is one of those episodes that is continuously ragged on by the internet. So I'm going to spare you the lectures about how bad Fear Her is. I will say I have some nostalgia for this, as one of my first Doctor Who DVDs was the Fear Her, Army of Ghosts and Doomsday DVD, which I watched relentlessly as a kid. However, this episode itself is not the best, especially when you take off your rose-tinted glasses, if you'll pardon the pun. I find Rose and the Doctor's dynamic in this episode to be a little bit too cutesy and slightly irritating at points. I also find that the adult characters in this story are like weirdly immature and kind of cringe as well. I'm not really sure what the reasoning behind that was. I know that it's the RTD era and everything's a bit camp cheesy, but this takes it to an extreme in some instances. Although at least we have Council Man. Everybody loves Council Man. I also just think that one of the issues with this story is that the threat is hard to take too seriously, because God bless her, they've got a child who has to play basically a regular, sympathetic child, a child that's been befriended by an alien, an evil, rageful alien inside that child, and then also a nice alien inside the child. And bless her, she's trying her best, but she just can't quite pull it off, and it leads to some scenes that aren't particularly great. However, I will give it this. The concept of a child drawing things and them either coming to life or, you know, people getting trapped in the drawings, really cool idea. I just wish it was in a story that was a bit more creative and a bit more out there. I feel like this sort of concept would fit the Moffat era more than the Russell era. Does that make sense? There's also that bit towards the end where the Doctor carries the flame, which is very, very cheesy. As I said, this story really does push the boundaries of cheese in Doctor Who, although I will give it this, that opening scene where the TARDIS lands in the town and it's basically stuck the wrong way around. Genius. Next up, I think I'm going to go for dinosaurs on a spaceship. Now, to be clear, I am one of the resident Series 7 defenders here on this website. I actually think it's generally quite overhated. However, I felt like I at least needed to include one episode here, and dinosaurs on a spaceship fit that bill. Don't get me wrong, again, it has some fun moments, and I generally like the inclusion of Brian Williams. I think he's a fun enough character. But there are a couple of fundamental issues I take with this. Number one is the cast is way too big. You have Nefertiti, this hunter guy, neither of which are particularly memorable, and then you've got Brian Williams, Amy, Rory, and the Doctor, and it's just a bit too crowded. Also, despite its wacky premise, This episode is remarkably forgettable. You'd think for a story called Dinosaurs on the Spaceship, it would stick in your brain for more than 5 minutes, but it really doesn't. They kind of waste a lot of the casting as well. Like, they cast 2 great comedians as the robots. I forget their names off the top of my head, I'll probably edit them in. And they just waste them. They just have a few voice lines, and it's like, all right, why were they here? Like, they just don't need to be here. And there's also that really weird scene where the Doctor blows up David Bradley's collector guy, the guy collecting all these historical figures, I guess. And it just feels remarkably out of character for the Doctor to me. Next up, I think we should go with some Chibnall, and I'm going to say arachnids in the UK. Oh boy, this is one of those ones that have not aged well. So first of all, you've got the entire premise itself, which feels extremely basic. Spiders invading a hotel that are supersized due to toxic waste. It feels like filler, which, to be fair, a lot of Series 11 feels like filler to me. It's one of my problems with that series in particular. I also make the case that Trump Man is incredibly obnoxious, and this was released in 2018 when Trump parodies were already getting a bit stale, and rewatching it these days, yeah, it doesn't help it. This also has another famous Chibnall issue of just having a really big side cast for no reason. You have the Doctor, Yaz, Graham, Brian, the scientist lady, Yaz's mum, who is barely ever seen again after this point, Trump Man, and various other people who get killed off. It's just too much. The one scene in this that I think is quite good is the scene in which Graham goes back to his house and is remembering Grace, and he sees Grace's ghost in the house. I think that's quite nice. Beyond that, this story feels so empty. The ending where they all join the TARDIS feels really like, whatever. You know, I'm not really buying the reasons you're going on board the TARDIS, really. It feels really quite weak. And that ending where they're all like, no, you can't shoot the spiders. We must let them suffocate in a room till they die. Objectively, in my opinion, Trump Man had the better solution to that problem. Killing it would have been more humane. How have you made a Trump parody and then made Trump look like the reasonable one in that equation? I don't understand how you've managed to do that. It was one of those episodes that really started to turn me off from Series 11 in general, and yeah, I just don't like it. Returning to the David Tennant era, for our next pick, we have the Lazarus Experiment. Now, overall, I think Series 3 is an incredibly strong series. The Lazarus Experiment, for me, has always been a bit of a weak link. This episode pretty much solely exists to set up the master de-aging and aging up technology used in the laser screwdriver in the finale, and also to set up that the Jones family do not trust the Doctor due to Saxon / the Master's influence. Beyond that, as a story on its own, this is the most fillery, run-aroundy episode of Doctor Who I think I've ever watched. Not completely devoid of its moments. I particularly like the scene towards the end, where the Doctor and Lazarus are discussing mortality in that weird church with the organ. That's all cool. Beyond that, though, like I said, it just feels incredibly generic. And I'm not one to normally rag on Doctor Who visual effects, as I know it's a show that, you know, doesn't have as much budget as the big contemporaries. However, that Lazarus monster is one of the worst things that I think I've ever seen in terms of CG, and it just makes it really difficult to take the threat seriously when you're looking at it and just going, what is that? What is that? Not in like a, oh my god, that's terrifying kind of way, but in a, what were they going for there kind of way. So yeah, overall, it's just kind of the weak point of Series 3, really. And on rewatches, I tend to skip it, especially because the Master summarises the whole aging up technology in Sound of Drums anyway, so you can kind of just skip this one and still know what was going on. So yeah, not a big fan of Lazarus Experiment. Next up, I think we'll go for another Capaldi-era one, and I'm going to choose Magician's Apprentice, Witch's Familiar. Our first of the two-part stories. I really don't like this story, and I never really have. Immediately, they completely changed 12's character to be a midlife crisis having rock star granddad figure, and he rides in on a tank, and he's saying dude to all these medieval people, and I'm just like, no, why? And I know some people are going to say, well, actually, if you look at it, this is actually the natural progression of his arc. The thing is, we don't see him get to this point. His arc or his progression to this point happens mostly off screen. So immediately, it's just whiplash between Series 8 and Series 9. Beyond that, I think Clara in this episode is quite annoying. Like that scene in which Missy and Clara are talking about the Doctor's confession dial, and Clara automatically assumes she's like the Doctor's best friend, and like the only one that would ever get the Doctor's testimony, even though the Master had known the Doctor, or Missy had known the Doctor for thousands of years. It's just annoying. And then we get to Skaro, and they have some really cool scenes with the Doctor and Davros, and obviously there's the whole sort of retreading of the Genesis kind of idea of, if, you know, you saw basically space Hitler as a child, could you then kill him? And there's some really interesting conversations between the two, but then they reveal that actually they're both lying to each other, and none of that was real, and the Daleks themselves get some of the worst treatment I think they've ever received. There's so many things that they add to them that are just completely unnecessary. For example, making it so that when you're saying exterminate, the Daleks could actually be saying, I love you. And they say exterminate so they can recharge their guns. I hate the way the Daleks are characterized in this story. And a lot of the humor doesn't quite work for me either. This two-part for me was kind of the beginning of me really not being into Doctor Who for a little while. Returning to the Jodie Whittaker era, I'm going to go with Praxis. This was my choice for Series 12. Now, to be honest, there's a couple of choices I could have made for Series 12 and 11 and 13, to be honest. But I picked the ones that I absolutely didn't like the most, because I know a lot of people would probably have put Orphan 55 in the place of Praxis here. And I get why. However, I kind of get ironic enjoyment out of Orphan 55 in the same way someone could enjoy The Room. Praxis, on the other hand, is one of the most dull pieces of television, in my personal opinion. Some people really, really enjoy this one, and I just don't get it. The one thing I'll give it is that it does the political economic allegory better than Orphan 55 does, but beyond that, it's just incredibly boring. It has that thing of like, oh look, here's a bunch of locations. Now we're in Japan. Now we're over here. Now we're over there. It's just like, stop. Also, the main villain is a twist villain. Isn't a human, but is visually like indistinguishable from a human. It's like, all right, I don't care, really. The characters are really forgettable to me. I'll give it this. The visuals of the infection look really cool. And I guess points for not killing off the two gay guys in it, because I really thought they were going to do that. But beyond that, I've always found Praxis just so boring. I also really hate how there's like this social media pair of girls, and one of them dies, and the other girl is just completely unfazed by it. It's like, your best friend just died. Have some emotion. But she just doesn't. It really annoys me. And I just generally find when a lot of media does social media influences, it to be incredibly cringy and date very, very quickly. So yeah, overall, this one's kind of boring to me. The characters aren't all that. There's too many locations with not enough going on. Yeah, Praxis goes in here for me. Next up, I'm going to go for Survivors of the Flux, the Series 13 or Flux episode. Now, it's difficult with this series because it all tells one self-contained story. And I was tempted to put the Vanquishers on here as well. However, what made me put the Survivors of the Flux on here over the Vanquishers is that this episode to me feels entirely pointless. At least with the Vanquishers, it resolves some stuff, I guess. And I use that term loosely. But Survivors of the Flux introduces a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be in the story. So just to give you a rundown, the three companions, so that's Yaz, Dan, and Professor Jericho, are going across the world to find a pot that tells them the date to the future and reconnect with Carvanista. Eventually, they find Joseph Williamson that leads them to the tunnels that allows them to access the future anyway. Oh, and also, them getting to see Carvanista is ultimately pointless because Carvanista deadass just goes, well, I can't time travel to the past where you are. Their entire subplot is completely pointless. It doesn't need to be in the episode. Then we have the unit segment of this story, which exists to show the Grand Serpent infiltrating unit at various points in its history so he can weaken unit to the point where the Sontarans can invade, which once again doesn't need to be in the story because the Sontarans happily invaded prior to this episode without unit being weakened. So why exactly did he need to infiltrate unit? There's no reason for it other than to show some of the history of unit and mess up the dating of unit even further. And then you have the third bit, which is the Doctor and Tectayun discussing her past, which basically just exists to tease you about possible answers that you may or may not get, and has some weird dialogue that doesn't make much sense, like, morality is a strength. You do realise bad people have their own sense of morality, right? it's not good. None of it feels like it matters at all in the long run. And obviously, especially because the Tom's Child, ultimately, nothing really happens with it. You've got 3 segments of this entire episode, which is basically the whole episode, which just don't really matter. Which means that, for me, this episode is the worst of Flux because it has nothing redeemable or, I guess, worthwhile in it. Like I said, at least with the Vanquishers, whilst that might annoy me more in some places, at least it tries to resolve some stuff. This just doesn't even bother. It just adds things that aren't relevant in the slightest. Next up, we have the Rebel Flesh two-parter. This is the Matt Smith two-parter, Series 6. This is one of those episodes that I just find very, very dull. It's sort of a Base Under Siege type deal with these things called the Gangers, which are basically flesh copies of people. And it has some interesting ideas, but I'll say visually it looks terrible. The characters aren't memorable, and the main characters feel weirdly out of character and kind of mean. And I don't think it was intentional. It feels kind of strange. Once again, I feel like kind of with the Lazarus Experiment, this one is just something that exists to set up the future sort of revelations, as during this we have Madame Kavarian injecting herself into these scenes until it's revealed that Amy was actually a ganger this whole time and that her and her baby were being held by Madame Kavarian. This episode itself just feels kind of irrelevant, pointless. The characters aren't all that great. It visually doesn't look very good. I just don't love it. I've always found it a massive step down for Series 6. And then finally, in last place, and this is the one that I would genuinely consider the worst on this list, Legend of the Sea Devils. If you've been around on this channel for the last year, you'll know I really don't like Legend of the Sea Devils. To me, it has every issue the Chibnall era has ever had, times by 100. It has so many scenes of just needless exposition that just drags out what should be an incredibly simple plot. It has side characters that are not memorable in the slightest, and they make decisions on a whim. For example, there's one pirate guy whose dad gets killed by Madame Ching, and within the span of like 20 minutes, he goes from despising her and wanting her dead to being her adopted son. And there's nothing to really show that development whatsoever. The editing in this episode is really choppy. It looks, again, I'm not trying to hold Doctor Who visual effects against it, but it looks really cheap. The Sea Devil jump, the mouth movement, it all looks really sloppy to me. It feels so slow, but also so fast, like the pacing is all over the place. The best scenes in this would probably be the scenes between the Doctor and Yaz, specifically the one where they're underwater, and even then, those scenes don't really amount to much. In my opinion, Thasmin was like a damn squib. It didn't really amount to anything. And I also just hate that, like, the Doctor compares Yaz to River, her literal wife, when we've seen no such chemistry between these two. That would indicate such a strong bond. I don't care what anyone says, we hadn't. And overall, this episode just doesn't really have anything redeeming about it to me. Also, the Sea Devils. The Sea Devils, they bring them back for the first time in, what, 30 years? And they don't even feel like Sea Devils. They're just, their plan is literally, oh, we're going to flood the world and make the world aqua again. But it's like, when you were roaming the Earth, the land existed. Humans didn't plonk it down because the Silurians exist. So you're going to just drown the Silurians as well. Also, they don't even touch on the political aspect of, oh, should Sea Devils and Silurians and humans cohabit the planet? Not even mentioned, which is funny because Chibnall wrote the Silurian episode for Series 5, where that's a main focus. So why that didn't even get a reference, and the Doctor pretends like the Sea Devils' claim to Earth isn't as legitimate as the humans, even though it very much is and has been shown to be. Oh, this episode infuriates me on so many levels. It's got botched morals, it doesn't look good, the cast is forgettable, the story is overly complex and also boring, and yeah, for me this is the worst episode of the revival, and I'm glad that we're past it now and I never have to think about it again after this video. But let me know in the comments below what your least favourite episodes of Doctor Who are. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.